All set.
Thank you. All right, we're good to go.
So good evening, everybody. I don't think I don't know if any of you ever would have predicted, if you've been joining us since March, that we would be saying, here we are entering our 9th month of the pandemic with no end in sight, as we're all watching the surges in COVID rates, the holidays coming up, which are worrisome in terms of the increasing surges and things remaining so difficult for so many families who have children and students with disabilities. We know that many, many students are still not getting all the services that they are required to be receiving through their IEPs, whether it's full-time or full-time remote or hybrid, or if there are some students who are receiving all day in-person instruction, but the services are still modified in many cases. And most importantly, a lot of you are still really watching your children regress in some instances, or unable to make the progress that you know that they should be making if they were getting all the services they need. So we realize that there's a lot of questions and concerns, why we decided just have a whole session around questions and answers. But we have to acknowledge, like we do every time, that during this pandemic, there are sadly no easy answers. We'll give you the best information we have, and we're hoping that you'll share ideas and strategies with each other as well. I'm joined tonight by Liza Hirsch, another attorney at MAC, and we're going to be answering your questions. Lilia Malikshi is here, our communication manager, who will be reading your questions, and Joanne Pino is here as well to help us through all of this. So we've got one polling question first about what kind of disability your child has, and Lilia, you've got more logistics.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us, and a special welcome back to our regulars. So tonight we'll be pausing. We'll have a short presentation and then we'll do your questions. Please submit those at any time using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us on Facebook, please submit your question as a comment under the live stream. If you see someone else's question that you'd like us to answer, please give it a like, and please keep an eye on the chat box in Zoom and the comment section on Facebook for resources we'll share throughout the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lilia. And we're going to do a very brief overview, so we have most of the time for Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over first to Liza Hirsch. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's wonderful to see all of you. Actually, I can't see anyone, but it's wonderful to have you all here. So as Julia said, we just wanted to emphasize a few key points before we turn to Q&A. Some of these points, many of these points we've discussed before, but it's always worth reiterating. The first point is that all IEP services must be provided during this time, whether your child is receiving services in person or remotely. All services on your child's IEP must be delivered. If you could just go back one slide there, Julia. The second point we wanted to make is that districts must notify parents about how IEP services are being delivered differently during this time. And they must notify parents in writing of this. One way that districts can do that is through the COVID-19 Special Education Learning Plan. There's a template that the state has provided that districts don't have to use, but that is available. But what is required is districts are required to notify parents in writing about how the services on your child's IEP are going to look different during the pandemic. The third point is that parents have the choice about whether to send your child to school in person or not. So even if your child is being offered in-person services, which many students are not right now, but even if your child is being offered in-person services, you have the option as the parent to opt for remote services instead. And of course, health and safety always remain the priority. And we wanted to note also that we know that many students are still not getting all of the IEP services to which they're entitled during this time. And I am fairly certain we'll be addressing that during the Q&A. So you could go to the next slide, Julia. So in terms of services offered in person, districts must prioritize for in-person learning students with significant and complex disabilities and needs, as well as preschoolers. And if you have questions about that, we're happy, in that criteria, we're happy to answer those questions. Again, even if your child is receiving all services or some services remotely, the IEP must be fully implemented. The school must deliver all services on your child's IEP. In terms of evaluations and IEP meetings, we wanted to note that the laws and regulations have not changed, meaning that all timelines are in effect with regard to evaluations and IEP team meetings, and all other requirements related to evaluations and team meetings continue to be in effect. Of course, there are more challenges sometimes getting evaluations completed and sometimes convening IEP team meetings, but school districts are still required to do both of those things, and we're happy to answer questions about how to make sure those things are happening and happening effectively. And then finally, COVID-19 compensatory services. We imagine some of you have questions about this issue. These are services to make up for services that your child either didn't receive or couldn't access during COVID-19. And it may be that your child is still not receiving certain services that are on his or her IEP. And I would just really encourage you to continue to keep track, even now, of any services that your child should be receiving that are written on the IEP that your child is not receiving. It's really important to keep a log, a daily log, and track whatever services your child continues to either not receive at all, or perhaps services that your child is having difficulty accessing. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Julia.
Great, thanks, Liza. That was a really great overview. So we just wanted to highlight a couple, and again, very briefly, we can answer questions to the extent we're able to if you have some about these issues. But we know there's a lot of families who are concerned about the amount of instructional time their child is receiving services, whether it's full-time remote or hybrid or in person. And so the state has come out with some changes to their what are called their time and learning regulations, but the time and learning requirements are still in effect. So all students are still supposed to be receiving what's at a minimum of 5 hours of what the regs call structured learning time every day, and 5.5 hours for older students. Now, there's a lot of questions that we may be getting about, what counts as learning time? Is it sending home packets? What about synchronous versus asynchronous learning? And we can, if those things are relevant, try to answer some of those questions. But it's important to know that IEPs have to be implemented and kids have to be receiving instruction, for the amount of time that's required. There's also been a lot of questions for those students who are in school for summer part of the time. There's been some questions and further clarifications around the requirements to wear masks. I think most of you know that students with disabilities who need accommodations because they're unable to tolerate masks are still entitled to go in person to school when that's being offered. The state has clarified that students who are having difficulty wearing masks cannot be required to be in separate settings. They can't be required to stay at home. There was some confusion because the governor issued some new orders about wearing masks, throughout the Commonwealth, not in schools. But the same requirements are still in place in terms of the ages that students should be wearing masks in schools. If the schools are allowed to ask for documentation of your child's disability if they don't already have it. However, most students who have IEPs and 504 plans already, the district will already have that documentation. And then lastly, there's just, I know we're touching on some updates very briefly, but for any of you who have 3- and 4-year-olds who have disabilities, and if they have IEPs that require an integrated early childhood setting, there is now a process whereby a school district can apply for a very limited 3-month waiver if they are unable to develop an inclusive classroom for 3- and 4-year-olds. But the school district is required to first demonstrate that they've made a strong effort to provide the inclusive setting that 3 and 4 year olds might need based on their IEP, including looking at creatively trying to develop those options in the community. And that even if they get a 3-month waiver, they still have to be moving forward to try to develop the settings that'll implement the children's IEP. Liza, do you have anything to add to those updates before we open up to questions?
No, that's great. Let's go ahead and open it up.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and turn it to Lilia.
Great, thank you. So our first question, and we've had several questions related to this actually, how can you extend programming for youth ages 18 to 22 beyond 22 since they've missed so much time?
That's a great question. We've gotten a lot of those calls from our helpline as well. The only avenue that it's available right now, but that can be a very important avenue, is the student's right to compensatory services. So if, and there's a lot of guidance about this, and we can go into this in more detail if that's helpful, but the state has said that students who are at this point, and we're expecting further guidance given that the pandemic is going on longer than I think everybody anticipated in the spring and summer. But for any students who are turning 22 between March of this year and through the end of this year, then your school district should be prioritizing convening an IEP meeting to discuss exactly what this person asking the question raised. What services in the IEP have not been provided? What's been the impact of the inability to provide those services? Has the student regressed? Have they been unable to meet their goals and objectives and make effective progress? And then if that's the case, has the student been unable to even access learning remotely because of technology barriers or disability related barriers, then the school district is required to provide the compensatory services needed to address the lack of services during that time period. And the student will no longer be eligible at age 22 for IEP services, but the compensatory services can and should and must be provided after they turn 22. Liza, do you want to add anything there?
So a related question, our son is turning 22 in October. Our district is willing to give us compensatory transition and work-related services, but his IEP is so packed he can't fit it in unless he misses other things in his IEP. We would like to take compensatory services after 22 and use it for job training, but DDS says they think that would make the school the lead agency and they won't let him access DDS turning 22 funds. Is this true? And if so, what can we do?
It is not true. And there are a bunch of things you can do, and we are expecting more clarification from DDS and the Department of Ed. We and others are doing some advocacy because this parent is not the only one facing this confusion. DDS eligibility, if you look at the eligibility regs, and if this person calls the helpline, we could send them these regs, is based on the age of the individual. There's nothing about being eligible for special education specifically, because somebody's only eligible for adult services when they reach age 22. If a student can receive, as I just said, compensatory services after age 22, but they're no longer eligible for special ed. So there's a lot of confusion among the DDS providers around this issue, but it's very clear legally, and I believe we hope there will be some guidance from the state to clarify that the compensatory services does not in any way impact eligibility for DDS services. To the contrary, we believe that both agencies should welcome the opportunity to coordinate the provision of these compensatory services directly on the DDS program sites if that's what the family decides is most appropriate. Liza, do you want to add in there?
No, I think that was very, very clear. I agree.
But it may not be happening because I think a lot of DDS providers here, oh, there's still special ed services, then we can't be the lead agency. But that's not legally true at all. That's, I guess, just to kind of underscore that point when it's compensatory services.
Is there any way MCAS can be waived this year?
As of now, no. The State Board of Ed just met a few weeks ago, and they are still planning at this point to move forward with MCAS. The way MCAS will be administered, they're recognizing may well need to be different, particularly if students are not in school. And I think everybody realizes now it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. So as of now, the state is definitely planning on moving forward with MCAS. They're recognizing that the way it's administered and will need to be administered at home in some instances will be different. They're going forward with MCAS Alt for students who have more significant disabilities. And I think what we've learned from this pandemic is none of us can predict the future. What will be possible as things change in ways that we can't predict.
Another transition question. My daughter is turning 22 in July. Can we get the 17 months missed of job and vocational training?
What you would have to do to try and, did you 17 months?
Mm-hmm.
Where's 17 months come from? Oh, it'll be 17 months by July, assuming that nothing's happening by July of 22. Is that where 17 comes from?
Yeah, I guess she's turning 22 in July. Yeah.
So if that's, so Liza, jump in at any point. I think it's very, when the state issued their guidance on compensatory services that maybe Lilia, you could drop into the chat at some point as we're talking, that guidance was based on the assumption, the wish, the prayer that by the time the school year 2021 started this fall, that things would have changed enough that IEPs were still, were now being fully implemented, and that most kids would be in person. And sadly, that's not come to fruition. So the current compensatory services guidance only prioritize students turning 22 through the end of this calendar year. But if students turn 22 in July, in March, in February of next year, and that those students are still unable to access much of their IEP services, then the compensatory claims will be continuing to accrue. And so the process, whether you're turning 22 in July or April or February, is to convene an IEP meeting. The districts are obligated to initiate that meeting with you and determine what we talked about before. What services was your child unable to access? What was the impact on their learning? And what is the amount and type of compensatory services that might be available? And job training and travel training, the whole range of services, the state has been very clear. They have a specific appendix around transition services, and the full range of transition services are available if that's what's necessary to compensate for the loss of services.
Yeah. Next question. My child has not been able to participate in remote learning since last April due to his disabilities. We've gone fully remote due to COVID. They are now marking him as absent. I asked for help, and they're trying to have his para join a Zoom class. His issues are sensory and social. Can they mark him absent? It feels like they're punishing him for his disability.
That is a really good question. And Liza and I can answer what we think, and we want to watch very carefully what happens to students and to families to make sure that there's not punitive consequences when children are unable to participate in remote learning because of their disability, or because they don't have high-speed internet, or because things aren't provided in their primary language. In our view, if a child is determined, if the child's not participating, that needs to be noted, and the child may well be absent, but that's different from having a punitive response for that. The response of the school district, and the state's been very clear about this, is that the school district should be proactively reaching out to any child's family who is absent and ascertaining why that is. It sounds like the school district in this instance is already aware that it's disability related because they're experimenting with trying to provide a remote paraprofessional. Is that what it was, Lilia? So it seems that the school district's already acknowledged that the inability to participate is disability related. I think it'd be really good for you, and you're probably already doing this, is to document that in whatever kind of emails or other correspondence you have with the IEP team. And we're arguing that those should be considered excused absences. There should be no punitive consequences for the student or the family. Liza, can you jump in here?
Yeah, no, this is an issue that we're seeing come up more and more, and it's really disappointing when we see school districts taking a more punitive approach to absences that are clearly related to some form of barrier. Oftentimes we're seeing related to the student, barriers related to the student's disability. So it might be that a student is having a really hard time engaging and really not really able to access remote learning. We've seen a number of instances like that where they're sitting in front of the computer screen, but they're not really able to learn that way. And so, they may be absent from some of those sessions because they're really not accessing the material, or because of behavioral issues that are disability related. And in addition to advocating for those absences to be excused, I think what we would advise is for parents to request an IEP team meeting. Especially if it's not just one absence, but it's happening repeatedly and you feel like your child really is not able to access remote learning, or there are some barriers there, that's really an issue for the team that the team needs to be addressing through the IEP process and thinking together strategically and creatively about how to address the issues. And it may be that your child needs additional, modifications or accommodations or other kinds of creative solutions other than just the paraprofessional. The only other thing that I'll note is that some districts are taking, very punitive measures in response to student absences, such as in some cases even filing 51A reports to DCF or truancy, child requiring assistance, truancy applications in juvenile court. We hope that these are more rare, that these are the exceptions, but we definitely have been conducting advocacy to make sure that those steps are not taken if the real issue is a barrier related to the student's disability or related to technology access or language access or other kinds of barriers. And we would just encourage parents to really be advocating with school districts to address whatever the underlying issues are, whatever the actual barrier is, to convene the IEP team meeting to address issues that way, as opposed to through any kind of punitive means or an ongoing unexcused absence record.
Great, thanks.
So we have a couple of questions related to the 5-hour learning time. Someone says, I'd like to understand better what 5 hours of structured learning is. On our remote days, the learning time is less than 3 hours and the rest is assigned asynchronous work. Does this asynchronous work count towards structured learning time?
I can tell you what the regulations say, and this is again an issue where I think we're going to be getting, we all hope we're going to getting some more guidance from the state. The state, there is a definition, and I don't know if I can get it to Lily in a way that we can put into the chat, but the definition is pretty general about what structured learning time is. Times that I'm going to try and say it in a way that it makes sense, but it's time that students are engaged in what's in regular, this is for all students, not necessarily students with IEPs, that students are engaged in regularly scheduled instruction, which could be asynchronous, and it clearly can be asynchronous or synchronous. And even during non-COVID time, doesn't always have to be time where teachers and students are present. It can include directed study or some level of independent study, but it really has to be focused on learning, not just homework and practicing skills. And so there's a lot of questions about the asynchronous learning. And so what has been added to the regs is that even when students are learning asynchronously, that students have to have opportunities to be regularly interacting with teachers, with feedback, with office hours, with some regularly scheduled interaction with the students. And so that's what's the case for all students without disabilities or with disabilities. So for students with disabilities, you have the general language, and then you have the fact that what's in the IEP has to be implemented. So, one of our chats, I can't remember when, but recently, there were some questions about when students get packets, or if they have social skills or communication skills, how can they be learning those skills if all the time is asynchronous, where they have no time to really be practicing their social skills and their social interaction skills. So for students with disabilities, it may well be that it's not possible to fully implement the IEP with a heavy load of asynchronous learning. We know the state's very concerned about this because they are just finalizing, pulling together the results of a survey they did of all the school districts to get a sense of what the practices are. How much interaction is there with teachers? How much is sync and async? How many students with disabilities are actually in person? And we're hoping and expecting, and many people are advocating for more guidance, because there's a real concern that, at least, for focusing on the needs of probably all students, but with the lens of students with disabilities, that the asynchronous learning is not adequately implementing the IEPs, so they're really not meeting the requirements for the structured learning time that's needed to implement their IEP. I don't know if that made any sense, but it's kind of a combination of the special ed laws and the learning time laws, and it's going to be. I think it's going to need more guidance from the state, because there were questions about this balance of synchronous and asynchronous. One of the experts that we had speak in one of our chats talked about how for some students with disabilities, they might be able to practice skills, without direct instruction or with packets. But in terms of actually being instructed and learning new skills, for some students, it's going to need to be synchronous learning for the most part. And again, it's going to really depend on your own child's IEP in part. Liza, can you add any further thoughts or clarification?
I mean, I think that was very comprehensive. I would just reiterate a point that you made, which is that school districts have to be implementing instruction and services during this time, as opposed to just resources and supports, which some school districts were implementing in the spring, which consisted of, packets and things like that. That's no longer sufficient now. They have to be delivering instruction and services. I think you mentioned that, Julia, among many other points. And then there was one other point I was going to make, but I think I lost it. So yeah, just making sure that instruction and services. The other point is just reiterating the frequent interaction with teachers, that's been made clear. So I think it makes sense for you to make sure that your child is both receiving instruction and services, some form of synchronous instruction, and that there's frequent interaction with teachers, and that communication is happening regularly, because the department has been very clear about that point.
And we've had calls to our helpline from families who've said that there's a check-in in the morning with remote learning, and then there's no interaction with the teacher for the rest of the day. And that to us does not seem sufficient or compliant with the time and learning regs. And we know from many kids with IEPs, they can't possibly access what's being offered, remotely, asynchronously, if there's no additional contact with educators or therapists.
Okay, and someone's asking if there's a link we can send so they can read about the structured class and asynchronous learning. Is there something we can send?
I can send a site to the regulations, or we could send it out when we send things out. It's probably going to be easier if we could pull this together to send out afterwards, but yes, we will definitely send it out.
Okay. So yeah, so if you're registered for this chat, you'll receive an email with that and this other resources.
The State Board of Education is having another meeting in about 2 weeks, a little bit less than 2 weeks, and they will be discussing the results of this survey that they've conducted of all the school districts. So I think we're going to be, I think we're going to be hearing more about this issue in the near future. We may not be hearing all the answers, but I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about it.
We've got a lot of questions coming in. We're going to try to get to as many as we can tonight. I put the helpline number in the chat if we aren't able to get to your question. Next question, does the 5-hour learning time apply to preschool? Our town only has full day program for very high needs kids and 2-hour program for others on IEP.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head for non-disabled 3- and 4-year-olds. For students with disabilities, it will be based on the IEP, right? There are some 3- and 4-year-olds who are in full day programs, and there are some 3- and 4-year-olds who are not in full day programs. And whatever is in the IEP has to be fully implemented. The state and the feds have been very clear about that. I believe that's accurate. If there's anybody out there who please, again, please share information with each other. Should they be doing that where should they be doing that, in the chat?
Yeah, in the Q&A, you can
the
put that in the
Q&A. I mean, I know there's a lot of really knowledgeable advocates and others out in the audience, so jump in if we're not getting it right or you have other ideas.
Keep an eye on that. Our next question is, if I've requested several times for a technology evaluation for my child and it's been ignored, or I've been told that the evaluation will be on a laptop that doesn't have the ability to touch, which my child works better with, what can I do next?
Another great question. There was it an assistive technology evaluation? What kind of evaluation was it?
I'm not sure. They just said a technology evaluation.
Yeah, so probably an assistive technology evaluation. So for any kind of evaluation, the federal and state government have been clear, and some of the findings from the state's complaint management system have reinforced that the existing timelines are in effect. So the person asking this question may well know this, but just to kind of set up the context, at the point that a referral or a request is made for any kind of evaluation, in this case for an assistive technology evaluation, then from the date, even during the pandemic, that request is made, the district has 5 days to get the parent the form to consent to the evaluation. And then after that, they have 30 school days to complete the evaluation. Now, if the district believes that they're going to have some issue and it may be difficult to meet the timelines, they can negotiate with you about whether or not you can come up with some collaborative way to address any need to extend the timeline, but the basic timelines stay in effect. To conduct the evaluation, I don't know if your district has any in-person services. Some districts that are not offering any in-person learning are still offering in-person evaluations. So some of our answer to this might help you to call our helpline. But they do need to figure out a way to make the assessment accessible. So if they're not able to provide it in person, or your families and it's not in a situation where your child can healthily go to an in-person setting, or for the healthier family, then they should be working with you to figure out how to make sure you have the technology and they can offer the technology to try and do it appropriately remotely. The last piece of this is, because if a child's unable to go in and receive an in-person evaluation, and if it's not possible to do all of the evaluation remotely, then the state has said that the district should look at doing as much of the evaluation as they can, getting information from outside sources, and trying to meet as many of the child's, in this case, assistive technology needs as they can, while they wait to complete other aspects of the evaluation. If some parts of the testing can be done remotely and other parts can't, then they should do everything that they can appropriately remotely. feel like it was kind of a muddled answer. Liza, can you help clarify that?
I think it was very comprehensive. Lilia, would you read the second part of that question again? I just wanted to make sure that we answered it. There was something about a touch screen.
Yeah, second. So I've been told that the evaluation will be done on a laptop that doesn't have the ability to touch, and my child works better with laptops that have that ability.
So if that's in person, then they clearly have to provide accessible technology. I mean, that could be kind of ironic if their district's offering inaccessible technology to figure out the technology needs of your child. I think that's kind of very clear legally. They have to provide things that are accessible. It might get a little bit more complicated if it has, that's why I didn't know if, I kind of assumed that was that the technology wasn't available at home. But if it's in the district, they have to provide the technology that's needed to fully assess any of the child's needs related to their disability.
Right, or if it's equipment that was provided by the district, if it's in home, but the equipment was provided by the district, I would say that it needs to be needs to meet your students' needs and accommodate their disability. So I think it sounds like you have a fairly good argument that they should be evaluated using the touch screen technology. And I think you could ask the district for that in order to accommodate your child's disability.
But again, call our helpline if we, because it's hard when we don't know all the details.
Right, our next question is, I have a patient who has not logged on to school 33 out of 49 days of school. The school hasn't filed and doesn't plan to. The reason is because the mom can't read or write English. They are incapable of using the patient's school laptop along with understanding it. The school says they can only offer picture instruction to the parent, and the parent says it's not helpful. What help is available to this girl? Can someone come into her home to help assure she logs into school?
There's a lot of, I'm always more of a visual than an oral. It's hard for me to hold on to all the details, so I may be missing some pieces of this, but, was this a literacy and this is a family whose primary language is not English and they're unable to read, or they're unable to read in English, or they're both?
It says the language is Cape Verdean Creole, so they can't read or write English.
So what's the first piece is that it's very clear, and the state has been adamantly clear about this, is that school districts have to be providing all of the communications in the family's primary language. So that includes the instructions for logging on to Google Classroom, or the instructions for homework, or having somebody who can communicate in the parent's primary language, call the parent periodically to help them have the information they need so that they can directly support their child. So there may well be ways that are already legally required to get the services to the family without having somebody go into the home. And the things that, I think this other family about the AT eval, and one question we didn't answer in that, which is also related to this question, is what can you do? Is the family can file a complaint, and we, and when I'm not talking, I'll put up where the link is with the, what is PRS? Problem Resolution System, PRS. The State Department of Ed has a site where families can go to file complaints for issues that can involve language access. It can, if the school district isn't conducting evaluation, an AT evaluation in a way that's equitable or timely, all those issues, and we can give more detailed advice through the helpline. An individual can file a complaint with the state, and they will, and we have begun to get some copies of some of their findings through a public records request, and we are seeing some good findings that the state has been making around some of these IEP implementation issues and evaluation issues. Liza, you want to add in?
Sure, yeah, I would just add in, because it sounds like this family both has a language barrier, as Julie was saying, but also a literacy barrier. And the state has been very clear that during this time, it's especially important for school districts to maintain regular communication with parents. That's already legally required under federal and state special education law, but the state has issued additional guidance making clear that during this time, that communication with parents is even more vital, and that it's really important for educators to be gathering input from parents and also addressing any barriers that families and students may have to accessing remote learning. And so in this situation, I would argue, based on all of that, that the district, I mean, first, you know, I'm questioning why the district hasn't been trying to call this parent to have phone conversations with the parent in her primary language with an interpreter. It seems to me like if she can't read instructions, then it would make a lot of sense to talk through some of it with her on the phone with an interpreter. I'm not sure whether the district has already tried that. It sounds like maybe they already have, and that hasn't worked, but I think that would be the first thing to try, is to make sure to be trying to have that oral phone communication with the parent with a qualified trained interpreter on the line. So that's the first step that I would take. And then if that is not working, I think we would just need to understand more about why that's not working, because to me, that seems like a very obvious next step.
And there are, because of there is an increased need for school districts to be providing interpreters and translators during the pandemic, because families need so much more information in their primary language. So the state is providing more resources into the 20 school districts that are the highest need in terms of the number of families who have limited English proficiency. So again, if we knew what district that is, it may be that there's already some additional resources available for the family, depending on the district. But even if they're not in one of those 20 districts, the school district is still obligated to figure out a way to provide language access.
And we've got someone from Desi actually in the Q&A here. I put it in the chat as well, with an email people can send emails to for translation services. Our next question is, my son is 3 with high functioning autism and was offered only 2 days during COVID, where some kids are getting 4 days. Should I push for 4 days? He's otherwise in a private preschool / daycare, and we're still negotiating the IEP.
Liza, you want to go with that one?
Sure, yeah, I think it would really depend on your child's individual needs. As we've noted, students with significant and complex disabilities and needs, as well as preschoolers, should be prioritized for in-person learning. And so I think that there's definitely, I think it varies district by district in terms of how much in-person services school districts are offering for those populations. But I think if you feel that your child needs more in-person instruction based on his or her individual needs, then there's certainly legally a strong argument to be made that should be provided. So I guess that's what I would at least start with. What would you say, Julia?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I know it's hard to kind of imagine this as we're dealing with surging numbers right now in the pandemic, but the state, the governor, have consistently been saying that in their view, all children should be receiving in-person learning, you know, that it shouldn't just be the students with disabilities who have significant and complex needs, that it should be done in a way that's safe, with safe ventilation, consistent with social distancing, but that all children, not just those with significant and complex needs, should be getting the in-person services they need as much as possible to meet their needs. So it's really just reiterating, regardless of the situation, families have the right and the process to speak up for what your kids are going to need in order to really implement their IEPs. It's not limited just to that more high needs group.
Next question. If an evaluation is pending, but the student is only doing remote, what would be the next steps other than waiting until they go to in-person?
Evaluation is pending. I guess this is meaning that a child is not yet been determined eligible for special education. Do you think that's what it means, Liza? I know we're guessing.
Yeah, either that or just that there's Probably eligibility, or just that an evaluation hasn't yet been completed.
So again, I'm not sure I'm quite, I don't know if the issue is that the evaluation is taking too long of a time, or that the parent knows that there's some disability related access issues, but they don't have an IEP, so they don't yet know how to address all those things. I'm kind of guessing what the question, I'm not quite.
Yeah, I'm not, if this person is still here, if you can, it's due, the evaluation is due.
So one thing just to clarify right off the bat is that the timelines for conducting evaluations are still in effect. And I think Julia mentioned in response to a previous question that the evaluation needs to be conducted within 30 school days of the school district's receipt of the evaluation consent form. And so that's one thing that you can do if your child if you're awaiting a completed evaluation, is just count out the days on the calendar, the school days on the calendar, and then mark on your calendar when the evaluation is actually due, and make sure that the school district is in compliance with the timeline. So that's one thing that you can do. But it sounds like, yeah, it's not clear to me whether it's past due, and the student needs services, or what the situation is exactly.
And I guess the only thing to add, when we're not exactly sure that we're fully understanding the complexity of the situation, is to the extent if you're waiting for the evaluation, but you have information from other sources, if you have information from your pediatrician, if you have outside therapists or tutors who are working, and other people who can provide information to help the school district understand your child's needs and what kinds of accommodations and services they might need now while you're waiting for the evaluation, our suggestion is always to first reach out to your teacher, try to share the information, try to figure out some stopgap measure to work collaboratively to figure out ways to try and meet your child's needs while you're waiting for the evaluation.
So that, yeah, they're saying because of COVID, the evaluation has not been performed.
So if they're past the timelines, then the state has also been clear that what you don't want children who are waiting for initial eligibility to be deprived of any services while they're waiting for the completion of the evaluation. So the state has also said that the team can meet if they've got part of the evaluation done, or if there's outside information, the team could meet and write, what's kind of essentially an interim IEP or a partial IEP while they're waiting for the evaluation to be completed. There's ways to kind of try and make that happen as well, because the state does not want kids who are going to ultimately be determined eligible to be waiting for lengthy periods of time to start getting at least some of the services they need. The state's also been clear, and this isn't going to help you not worry about your child now, but is that if your child's evaluation was 4 months late, 5 months late, and then they were determined eligible, and so they were deprived of services for 4 or 5 months, then your child may well be eligible for compensatory services the way we talked about. But I understand you don't want to have to keep waiting, and try to make up for the lost services. You're trying to get the services as soon as possible. And that's what the state has told districts to do. Work creatively with families to figure out a way, given COVID, to move forward as quickly and creatively as you can.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate a point you already made, Julia, but to provide the school district with any documents that you have documenting your child's disability, because the guidance is very clear that the school district should be considering those documents more now, and potentially even coming to an eligibility determination based on those external documents in some cases. So I would gather that information and send that, any information, external information that you have, and send that over to the district.
Another question related to a student with absences from remote learning due to their disability.
Before we do that, I'm sorry, I just realized Liza and I are able to, and Lily and Joanne are able to stay till 9, but we know that a lot of people have to leave at 8:45. So for all of you who are here and just working so hard to get everything you can for your kids, thank you. I really wish it was easier and there were less barriers. And please stay in touch with us in any way that you can. We will be having another chat 2 weeks from now. And then our current plan is to go to monthly chats starting in January, just based on the feedback that we've received. We would love to get information, any ideas you have in the chat about ideas of other topics you would want us to talk about. Do you want more Q&As like this in the future? Do you want other experts to come in and talk about, services for older children, older students, transition services, basically behavioral services, anxiety? Are there specific topics you would like us to focus on in the chats to come? That's a long-winded way to say, give us your input, please, about what would be most useful for you. We would just want to support you in any way that we can.
Yeah, please share that in the Q&A and in the comment section on Facebook, and we'll put that information in the follow-up email also. So this question is also related to a student who has absences from remote learning due to their disability-related stuff. This person is wondering if there's a way for parents to communicate the non-punitive language that you were talking about earlier. Is there a regulation or a guidance that they can quote, or language that you can suggest?
There's some great language, and we will share that. I know Joanne, I'm sure, is helping to take notes of all the things that we're going to be sending. But there's fabulous guidance from the state about how districts need to be proactively looking at how to engage students, engage families, ascertain what the barriers are, and deal proactively and not punitively. And we can kind of pull together some of that information. That's a great idea. When Lilia, probably on Monday or Tuesday, will be sending out the information from this chat. But I have to say, I don't know if the person from the Department of Ed is still on the chat, but there have been massive numbers of guidances that the state has been working. Everybody's been working so hard. The state has, the school districts have, the teachers have. It's just been a whirlwind of all these months. And there have been so many guidances issued by the state to answer so many questions that it's hard to even find them. So it's a great idea for us to kind of synthesize some of that and send it along to you on the topics that have been raised here.
Question is it a violation of FAPE if the child is making no progress due to behaviors of remote learning? So making no progress with remote learning, I guess.
Again, without knowing the specifics, it's the law is clear. The state and the federal government has been clear that IEPs have to be fully implemented even during the pandemic, and the remote learning, if a child has to learn remotely, has to be provided in a way that's accessible, so that the child is still accessing and learning in a manner that's commensurate to what they would be doing if there weren't a pandemic. So that's why we have all this good guidance from the state about compensatory services, because they've recognized that if there's barriers that make it difficult for a child to be learning remotely, the first priority is to try to fix those barriers, because you don't want more and more months to go on where the child can't access learning. But that would be a denial of FAPE if the child isn't getting their IEP implemented. So the question is, what's the remedy? How do you fix what's being offered remotely so the child is getting a free and appropriate public education? And to the extent that that's not fully possible, how do you try to remedy it through compensatory services? But I think teachers, everybody's working really hard. And so we have seen things work out well when you as parents are very clear about what's not working. We've had families take quick videos of what's going on so the teacher can really see what's going on when the child's not able to access, and to work creatively to figure out solutions so they can start getting a free, appropriate public education as soon as possible. But it sometimes does take filing complaints and other things. But teachers really want kids to get the services that they need. And it's hard because they're not there seeing what's going on.
And again, it's just really important to be documenting, not only what services your child is getting and how they're accessing those services, if they're having difficulty accessing, documenting behavioral challenges, any challenges with progress in any skill areas. If you keep a log about those things, it'll be much easier for you to present to the school district, both to get your child what your child needs now, and then also for potential compensatory services down the line.
Okay. Our next question is, my child needs assistive technology to access text. Can a school refuse to support a family that's using their own computer on the basis that the family is not using a school computer? The district refused consulting parents and supporting students to help them manage the platforms and support the students.
It's hard to give the school district has to make sure that the child has the technology they need available to them at home to be able to learn remotely. You know, if there's technology that's needed to address their disability, then that somehow the district has to make sure that that's available. It sounds like in this place, the family has it, but the district doesn't want them to be using their own technology. So, I mean, arguably the district could provide and pay for the same thing, but they have to allow the child to have accessible technology that meets their disability related needs. Liza, do you see it any differently?
It sounds like, so they said the student even pre-COVID would need direct help and instruction managing technology and needs assistive technology to access text. So is the school allowed to refuse to support the family on the basis that the family is not using a school computer?
Not in a way that makes sense to me, but I think it would be really good to call the helpline because I feel like there's some piece we're not understanding. I mean, that's what I was trying to say is if the school district for some reason doesn't want this parent to be using their personal computer, then they would need to be providing comparable technology on the school computer. They can't say, we know that your child's because of disability needs a Dynavox or whatever it might be, but we're only going to let you use the Chromebook if the Chromebook doesn't accommodate the child's disability. But I'm not sure that's what the parent's asking. I'm sorry. We probably have time for one more question, right? Pick a good one. They're all good ones.
They are all good ones, and I put the helpline number in there. If you call our helpline, then we can discuss these more in depth.
And there's a way to email the helpline too, right?
There's our website, massadvocates.org/helpline. That's in the chat as well. You can copy and paste your question directly into the form there. Our last question is, can you elaborate on some of the ways teachers' aides can be used creatively during remote learning?
That's a great question. That'd be great to have one of our, that might be a great topic to have an educator come talk about in one of our future chats. I do know that we've gotten a lot of questions when kids having their IEPs. So there could be just a regular classroom aid. And we've had a lot of calls and questions from families where their IEP, the child's IEP calls for a one-to-one aid or a small group aid, an aid working with a small group of children. And again, if this is remote learning, those paraprofessionals still need to be provided. And I think we have heard some families talk about creative ways that the paraprofessionals are working in terms of previewing information with the children ahead of time, going into breakout rooms. But I really feel like we could bring in some educators that could do a good job of talking about some of the best practice for using paraprofessionals remotely. That's a great, in the remaining seconds, if other people would be interested in that topic as for a future chat, we could do that. Liza, anything to add on that before we start to
Well, just quickly, just in the in-person setting, I know that DESE has specified that paraprofessionals could be used to facilitate push-in services for inclusive services. So if they're limiting the number of educators or specialists in the classroom, for example, that the paraprofessionals could be really well trained in order to support inclusion in the in-person context. So just wanted to note that as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Liza. Thank you, Lily and Joanne, and really thanks to all of you for all of your dedication to your own children, to the children that you work with and advocate for or teach or are physicians for. I know we have a wide audience, and we just really appreciate the community's commitment to supporting children and families in these unbelievably stressful times. We're fortunate to work with such a great community, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank
Good night.
you, everyone. If you have ideas for future chats, I'll leave that Q&A open a little longer so people can share in there. A lot of transition age folks.